Oh, here it is right here. Okay. All right, this MR widget re-architecture, we've talked about it a few times. First, my perspective in this is like we have bigger problems, and some of those problems are uh, the relationship between continuous integration and code review. That was my main priority because what will happen, and I think that we all have different goals with this architecture widget, except for maybe you, Kai, but I think we're all hoping it'll solve a different thing. But for me, what really kind of sealed the deal is our biggest problem with S1s, S2s, and continuous integration is the issue will come in and it will take, say it comes into code review, it'll take like 3 or 4 months on a good issue for code review to investigate it and see what's happening here. It's not always clear, and also we have other priorities. Then when we do investigate it, we're like, oh, this isn't even our issue. I actually think it's continuous integration. And then we kick it over to them, and then the same thing happens to them. They don't have time to triage it. When they finally do, it's like they have to dig into it just like we did. And so it's not really clear. And so I wanted to work on that really before the widget. So Carrie has been the DRI for that key result, and we've talked with their group, and we've been keeping track of how many issues come in that border the boundaries, because remember, that's our real goal. And it's like 5 a week where we will get an issue and it's like, whose issue is this? What's causing the problem? And so she has gone through a lot of this stuff, and we're really confident that maybe not the entire architecture, but at least starting the re-architecture will resolve the S1, S2s, which by the way, we have so many we can't even burn down. The time to resolve those anyway, and start clarifying the border. There's also the concern that Pedro has done, by the way, beautiful work, like exactly what I had asked for from the continuous integration team is what Pedro spent all that time on. So time well spent. But there's the concern that his work is going to change what our re-architecture is. And we want to be super mindful of that. I don't think that it will change anything. Really, what we're trying to do with the re-architecture is not necessarily change how we fail or even what the message is when we do fail, but we just want to make it more clear, where did it fail? And if we can just get where did it fail, then we should be able to determine, is this our issue? Is this a CI issue? And who needs to work this issue? So that's kind of what changed my perspective on this. Thoughts?
Yeah, just want to say, yeah, thank you for the praise. It took a long time to do that work, and I'm not terribly concerned about it being affected because it was just a documentation of what is in place today, and the idea is that for that to evolve, but for the time being, I didn't put it in another location, and I think that it should be in another location that is more easy to consume and easier to update anytime we make changes without having to go into the code and check what those are, because I think it helps everyone. It helps not only the engineering folks, but also the design team and our users in figuring out why the merge request is in that state. So yeah, I'm okay if it gets outdated very quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. We want to abstract that work so that it's easy to change. And I think from the CI perspective, Andre, I'm not sure if our front end team does this the same way, but any time, so if the end goal is like to make that super flexible, right now with CI, anytime that needs to change, it's a backend engineer and a front end engineer that has to make that change, which is like crazy. So I know that's one of their main goals. But that kind of future direction will certainly help there. We just want to get to a place where engineers themselves understand where these things are happening. And then in the future, we can get to a point where it's like, okay, now everybody can understand where these things are happening, including our users.
There's a Roomba in my office that like got stuck last night, and so now it's talking about how it's stuck, and you'll do this like every 5 minutes. So what I guess what's not clear to me is like, what are you proposing? Because what and I will say my concern is that what CI is proposing and what I have seen is sort of like a future world that would be influenced or would benefit from us saying this is what we want the end state to look like.
I agree and disagree with that. I think that probably is the end goal, but I think that Pedro has a lot of say in that. What I am proposing is that our team starts in cahoots with their team, starts breaking down these issues in terms of what are the next steps to abstract where these errors are coming from. So for example, an easy example is the draft. You can't merge until it's out of the draft state. So an easy example would be if we can just separate that failure into a different area. It's still going to fail the same and it's still going to happen the same. But as an engineer, now at least we understand where it is failing at, and then we can correlate that back to code review. And they get really specific and technical into that. And I think that is something that we need to discuss and iterate on and work through. They get really technical with that. But in my mind, the most important part is really just that failure happens in a specific file that is easy to find. And that's kind of what it is. It's a very tech debt kind of thing.
Okay, so, and I made this point, I guess, on the call that you weren't on, is like, are we refactoring, which is what it sounds like you're proposing, which is like, we're not changing the way anything works. We're sort of moving things around in files and leaving the code functioning the same way, and the backend and front end will still be more complicated than we'd like them to be in the end state. Or are we actually sort of changing the way everything works as we're doing that, right? Like those are two different things. And I want to be very clear that we're the one where we like, where CI's proposal is like, we want to build this JSON data structure that everything on the front end consumes this, and this is how like all the data will be presented, is sort of their proposal. That is re-architecting, and that is like, in theory, net new functionality that is opens up the opportunity for things to get significantly worse before they get better, right? Because we at least know how things work sort of today. More than we would
I
if
would
we like,
disagree with that.
but it at least works, right? Like we may not know, like it at least functions at a level that we all sort of go, yeah, this is not ideal, but like push comes to shove, we could figure out how it happened and what it's doing. Whereas like if we're deciding like we want to change that, the way all of that works at the same time, like that not never. So there's a lot of risk associated with that versus like if we're like, oh, we want to take this controller and move it to its own separate like file, so that way like it's over here, and then when we see the error message we like know which piece of the controller failed, versus like,
Yeah,
we're going to build a whole new API.
I think it's probably both. And Andre can talk to that. So I think the answer to your question was more clear in the beginning until you brought up maybe the JSON structure, which I really do support. And again, I think Andre's probably more involved in that than anything. But from my perspective, from a backend perspective, if we can, taking draft as an example, we can move that to a separate location and then have just that respond with the JSON as like that's an iteration. Then we can, maybe it still works the same as today, but that data is retrieved in a different format. So maybe some errors still happen today because we haven't gotten there yet, but other areas are using this new form. Does that make sense?
Does I think I also am not opposed to going like sort of the backend handling all the error and dealing with this JSON structure, and like the front end sort of being more consumery versus controlling logic. But if we are going to do that, I would rather do that knowing what we need to be at the end, so that way we don't model an entire like API and thing, and then Pedro comes back and he's like, oh, well, I want you to show 8 error messages. And they're like, oh, well, the thing can't show 8 error messages because we didn't build it
Oh,
accounting for like, we didn't build,
no,
like,
no.
if we change things and don't build it in a way that accounts for what we need the end state to be, then we're going to be like implementing the new thing. And then we're going to have to refactor the new thing because we didn't account for what it should have been the first time we did it. Like, we're just doing it
Yeah.
out of order.
I definitely understand that sentiment and been there in the past, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think if anything, what we're doing is allowing Pedro to say whatever he wants to say with doing it this way, because
Yeah.
now basically what we're saying is like true or false, basically. And Pedro, do you want to show that with these other errors, or do you want to show it on its own, or do you want to show it in the nav bar, or where do you want to show it? And like, here's the data, we've already got it. I don't care where you put it.
But that would be net new functionality then.
It is technically new if you want to look at it that way. It's a new data response, yeah, but it's still the same failure. Pedro's work hasn't finished. So it's still the same failure. It's just now we're sending it in a different way. And we have to do it in a one at a time kind of way. And we have to really focus on what's the most important.
Yeah, from the front end perspective, I think I think Kai is right on one thing, well, on many things, but on one thing, I agree with him in that we'll be moving quite a few things on the front end to account for this change of logic to be living on the back end. And that could lead to a situation that once the end scenario that Pedro figures out comes in, that could lead for us to change that again. What I'm thinking is, whatever Pedro proposes, we will want to do this work too, to make the result more reliable and easy to work with. And the first step we're always going to have to do is translate what we have now before we introduce new logic and new states and new things. So that's why I support starting this effort. I do think we need to be mindful of how deep we go because of this. But there is a part of me that do think we need to get our house in order, even if we don't know exactly the end goal. But like Michelle was saying, we need to be able to clearly understand where the bug, the gap is coming from before we can address it. And I understand that the introduction of changes that come from the UX exploration can be significant and can be just rethinking the whole thing as we go. But there's another thing, which is if it's that much of a shift from what we have today, it's going to take us a long time to even put that in place. And until there, we have to live with the bugs that we have today. And this initial work will make that more easy to control. So I think as long as we keep that in mind, to not go too deep. Does that make sense, Michelle?
Yeah, I don't want to go too deep at all anyway. I'm really prioritizing this from the perspective of like, why do these S2s keep happening? What are those problems? Let's do those things. Like, you know, we keep getting S2s because we don't understand that it failed because of draft. I don't know why that's my easiest example. I'm just going to stick to it. So let's start with that one. Let's do that one. These other errors are super clear. We always know how to handle them. Like, let's do that one last. But I think I'm having a hard time understanding like how that would change on the front end. Are we talking more like the visual UI of the widget itself might change drastically?
So
no.
let me comment. So I think I'm comfortable with what the initiative is doing, because from what I understanding and after reading that issue many times, it's just taking what we have today, and turning it into consistent structure, the consistent response that will make it easier for us to build new checks, new mergeability checks, but also to diagnose and fix bugs that we have today. So maybe when we create this new structure, this new response, existing bugs will still exist and maybe others will be fixed along the way, but it will allow us to, as you said, Michelle, to reduce the amount of S1s and S2s given what we have today. So that's the first thing. I just want to make sure that I got that correctly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm on the same page as that. That's very elegant.
Okay, so the second part is the UX and what it will be in the future. And I don't, yeah, we don't know what's going to be in the future, right? There's always going to be changes. But what I can say is that, like, from my experience, looking at the research that we've done, looking at what other competitors are doing as well, taking all of that into account, the structure that we have today, which is, here is the check, here is what we're looking for and see if it's true or false, and here's what you can do to fix that, to proceed along the way and go towards the other checks. And I don't think that is going to change in the future, at least in the near future, unless in 1 year or 2 years we discover that there's a much better way to do this. I don't think that's going to change. I think there are two big problems nowadays with the mergeability checks. One is what you're saying, Michelle, that there are things underneath the surface in the backend and the front end, whatever it is, that just create collisions and conflicts, and weird bugs happen because it's not well structured. And that's what I believe this restructuring will try to mitigate. And then the other thing that we can all agree that it's not working well today is the messages themselves that are very inconsistent, and sometimes it's just difficult for a human being to understand what they need to do. And also their placement and just how they are presented in the user interface. So problems in the presentation layer and problems in how things are connected in the backend. But the result in a more abstracted way, I think that will stay and live on. So I'm comfortable with that structure, and later in the future we can iterate on it if we find that we need to do a very different way of presenting and building those checks. But looking at what has been proposed in the issue, and I mean, I'm still discussing this with Fabio and waiting for his response, but I think we're fairly open to what the structure can be to accommodate what we have today. So I don't see a big concern, but I agree with all of the other concerns that both Kai and Andre have pointed out.
And if I could just give an example of what you're describing, and just to show how struggling it is, how we struggle with today. So this is one of the problems we have right now, is that the final decision on how things can be acted upon right now come in a slew of properties that we have to have logic on the front and to understand what the conjunction of these properties mean for us, right? And what we're trying to take a step toward is having a one place that we can clearly understand what's the current state, right? And right now it's an amalgam, just a merging all of these properties together. What you're describing is evolving that one place into having a different vocabulary, a different representation, but we'll be on that place. And that will be already an advantage that we'll have, having that one place specified, rather than this cloud of properties that is like read by the front and interpreted by the front, and with a lot of gaps. So that's why I'm thinking about taking this first step towards that direction. Will be continued once we have your guidance later on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yep. And one thing that I still think we can do, like one of the ideas that I had proposed when thinking about the merge checks, is maybe like, what if in the future, instead of just showing one of the merge checks, we show a list of all of them and say, hey, these are the ones that are failing and these are the ones that have passed. so that you can plan ahead what you will do with your merge requests. So maybe you need to fix a pipeline, approve, and resolve all threads, something like that. This is just an idea, and I think with the knowledge, technical knowledge that I have in looking at what we're planning to do, I think that's still possible in the future to do with whatever we build, because it will be just taking the responses and listing all of them instead of just listing the first one that comes. So
that's kind of what I'm saying.
In theory, right?
I think it's like even more flexible, because if you want to do it that way, there's no extra work. It's already fine. Yeah.
And for historical context, when I looked back at how we started doing these merge checks, if I'm not mistaken, we just had the first one saying that you had merge conflicts, right? That was the first one. And then we added one for approvals, if I'm not mistaken. And even at the time, you weren't able to merge through the GitLab UI, which is crazy. I didn't know about that, but I thought since the beginning, like you could merge through the GitLab UI. No, in the beginning, in like the first versions of merge requests, we just had something saying, hey, this is good to merge, go to the command line and merge it locally and then push it, because we can't do it through there's no button, there's no merge button. And so I think with that, and with all of the community contributions over the years and different teams working on it, it's just a spaghetti code, right? That's how I see it. I don't know if it's how you see it as well, but this is how I perceive it.
It still feels like there are two things happening here to me, and this is my concern. Like Michelle's first pitch of like move controllers to different places so we know which file was called and then we can tell what the error is. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, because that's straight refactor, right? Like that is sort of the by definition version of refactor. The version that Andre just shows, where he's like, well, see all of these things that we do on the front end, we just want the one thing back from the back end, and now we know this. That is by definition re-architecture and introduces new functionality. And to me, that is the concerning thing. Like, we should do one or the other, but it sounds like both groups want to do sort of both at the same time, which potentially creates this like extra set of crazy bugs that might be happening, because now we might not know, oh, well, is it because we moved that thing, or is it because the front end is now looking in a different place to understand how that merge check works, because we've changed the way we like try and deal with some of these, but not all of them on the fly. And I think that is, to me, like what I'm concerned. I like the end state where the back end controls it all and the front end does it. What I don't like so far is that the proposals to get there all look really messy and want to do all of it at the same time and want to account for future state. Because if it was a refactor, no one should ever, not to belittle Pedro, but no one should be asking Pedro anything if it was a refactor, because we're not changing the user experience. We're not changing the UI. We're not accounting for future state, but we are asking Pedro. So we're not doing a refactor then, right? And if we were doing a re-architecture, we should only be asking Pedro when Pedro is ready and everything that we want to get to in the end state is well thought out and defined, right? To me, that is where I am stuck and hung up on, is that, but all the proposals want to do all of the things and they all want them to happen all at the same time. And this is far too fragile and brittle of an area in the application to have multiple teams making significant structural changes in flight all at the same time. Like, we will inevitably increase, like our S1 volume will go from whatever unfortunate and unhappy thing it is now to more. It will be more for a period of time because we're doing too much. And that is my issue with this right now, is the proposals want to do all of it. And until I see a proposal that like looks correct in terms of doing one or the other, and I don't have a preference of one or the other, but I don't want to do both at the same time, then like it's going to be hard for me to like support this and want to actually put this work in, because to me this is while the pitch is risk mitigation, there is far too much risk for me to be comfortable, and I'm very much of turn feature flags on and don't ship with feature flags, and this is well beyond my risk and pain tolerance.
Yeah, I don't think it's that bad. I understand where you're coming from though. So I think there's two different perspectives, and that's front end and back end. So front end is expecting like, can you just tell me the one thing that, or the two thing, or whatever it is? Can you just tell me those? And from a back end perspective, a lot of the times we can be like, yeah, we can tell you. We already have that code over here and we know where it is and there's no question. So we can tell you, here's the new response. That's the re-architecture. In some cases, we have no idea. So if front end wants to know, did this MR fail because the pipeline didn't pass and you had merge when pipeline succeeds and you had this other setting on, in some cases we can't tell. So we do need to refactor a little bit to even get that response to even send to the front end. But I don't think that the amount of refactoring work to get all of that data is so severe that it is introducing a lot of risk, or that's something that we would have already called out. But the fact is that we don't have a good grasp yet on what that looks like because we haven't devoted time to investigate like technically how we would implement it outside of that issue, which is based on really the response. There's work that has to be done to even get that response. We need to find out what that work is. But I think we're just on, I love Pedro. I think we're just including Pedro to be collaborative and supportive of each other and give him a heads up.
I was going to say, the questions that I've been asked so far, and I appreciate your concern, Kai, I do. It makes me feel valued and cherished and that you care about me, which is good. No, but really, I think the questions that have been asked so far is just that I did all of that mapping exercise, and because I'm probably one of the few people that has done that and has looked through all of the merge checks, they just want to make sure that, hey, what we're thinking, is it aligned with what we have today? Because that's what we want. We want what we have today. So it's just double checking. That's how I see it.
Like Pedro knows more than we do. I got an issue yesterday that had an error message and I spent 2 hours on this error message. And then I went to Pedro's issue and Control F for the error message, and it was in Pedro's issue. So that's like where we're at today. Of look, we need to rely on a product designer's research to understand how our code is operating.
It's everyone's research now. It's not mine anymore. It's there in the open. So you already know as much as I do. You just need to Control F.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's all fine. Again, my point is, I don't think the if when you say there is work we need to do before we do the thing that's being talked about in that issue, that's fine.
Yes.
But that work is not, that is not the focus of where people, every time this comes up, that's not where people start, is the work that needs to happen first. We keep talking about this like future JSON structure we want to use to send data, right? And again, that's sort of, when you started and you're like, oh, we want to move things to different controllers and do that, I was okay with that. Like, I actually think that's a good, if that helps us like sort of more quickly diagnose things, I'd love to see that proposal and like be supportive of that. The current one that exists is the thing that I'm not going to be supportive of. The current thing that is being described is, I'm happy if that is like step 4 or 5, but I need to see steps 1 through 3 first, if that's the case.
Let's back up then to my intent with this call. The question is, Kai, can we dedicate resources to this issue to understand what the iterations are and what we need to do? Like, this is a spike at this point. And it sounds like that's something you're willing to do versus actually work on it. I'm also unwilling to work on it blind. And so we need time. This isn't the same kind of issue as like what we investigate for 1311. This is like, we really need to look at this and think through it and start planning it out. And can we have the time to do that? Or is it not even worth it because it's going to be like a lot and not worthwhile?
I think we know that it's a lot and not worthwhile unless we do the investigation. My impression, based on the way people keep having this conversation, is that people are ready to like start building things. If you look at that issue, like that is in sort of like the I'm ready to start building things is the way I interpret that conversation. And I'm not ready to start building things. I don't think our team is. And this is again where like
That's maybe a difference too, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
yes, CI is like wants to go do this thing, and I don't very nervous that like a team that doesn't own the merge button wants to start going and doing something on the merge button that would be this significant. I think that's the difference. I'm 100%. You want an entire engineer for all of 1311 to like come back and then like have an actual thought out plan that like we could go and have a legit conversation about. Sure, I will give you an entire engineer for all of 1311. You want to go build stuff without having that done first? I'm not on board with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that analogy, I think I think I agree. CI is really much like gung ho, let's build it. Me and Michelle and Carrie were like, let's pump the brakes and grab the steering wheel first. Right, Michelle? Like we want to understand it better and to
Yeah,
kind of like steer it in what we
because
want to do.
coming from my perspective, like the question that I just asked Kai, I immediately said no 2 weeks ago to this. It's not worthwhile. We should not even look into it because we have these other problems. Now I'm at a point where like we should look into it. But yeah, I do agree there's a difference there as well within the teams. And I don't know, maybe this is something they can start working on when we oversee it, but I don't even know that. I don't even know that yet.
Yeah, we need to understand it better for sure. I wanted to voice I know that we're at time. Anybody has a hard stop? Can I?
I'm good.
Okay.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I was thinking about is it would be very beneficial for us to have some sort of representation. So that's what I'm expanding here on this D point. We could get the benefits of having some machine readable representation of the current state of the merge request widget state, mergeable state. But if we don't move anything on the way that the front end app is consuming the data coming from the backend, then we won't be incurring the risk of introducing new bugs, as Kai was saying, but we'll have the benefit of moving our things around in the backend to be ready for whatever comes next. I don't know if this introduces some performance problems of like having to compute more data, but we can even do that on a separate endpoint if we want to. But so there is something, and this is kind of like just a hint to something that we can keep in mind when we're doing the investigation is if we just build another additional property that is aiming towards the future, but it's not being consumed, it will allow us to do better debugging. And we will already be reaping the benefits of decreasing the time it takes to investigate the S1 and S2 bugs without affecting the current status of the application until we have the final guidance from Pedro. Just a thought. We don't have to have the answer right now, but I thought I'd voice it. Because I guess we reached the point where we know that we can start investigating and we'll have some capacity to investigate. And I think that's the point of this meeting, right? No.
I
Can
don't know
you
if that was the point, but that's
rephrase
where we got to.
what?
The point was to introduce clarity. We got to the
Yeah.
point where we at least understand that we need some capacity to investigate this and to understand better what we need to build.
Yeah. Yes. We need time to sit with this one. And we've already spent time sitting with it, but that time was spent like, should we continue down this path? And I think the answer to that for me is yes.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah, my point, I think it's one of the most important ones, is if we want to talk about capacity, who will be leading this? Because I don't like that another group is leading this. Not that they are not going to do a good job, but we should be on top of that 110%. And having them work with us is amazing. And it's really good that they are able to do that because we can share the knowledge. But we should be driving this because we don't know, like 1 year from now, if the CI team will be as interested in it. We will always be interested in this. So I would really like for our engineering team to be leading this, if possible. So Carrie, I think she's been involved a lot, and I don't know if at this point we need front-end representation, but if we do, someone, yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I see.
better to have someone involved. Better to have someone involved in case something pops up and it affects the way the front end consumes it. Yep. Yeah, so we can formalize it, and I'll find someone to be official the DRI for front end. Do we have an epic for this, Michelle?
No, that's what I want to happen.
All right.
When,
so let's
but I don't think it can happen right now. I mean, maybe a blank epic.
Right. Blank.
Yeah, I would like create the blank epic and then create the issue for that we're going to use in 13.11 for investigation. And then,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, I would at least get those out, and then that way we know. And then I guess the ask and the planning issue is let me know, or either eat it out of capacity numbers that you're giving me, or do something else to like account for this, like whatever. And I don't have strong opinions about how much time this takes. This is arguably the most core and critical thing to like what we do in code review is like the merge button, because if that thing's all broken, you can't actually get to the end goal that we want. So I don't have strong opinions if we pull back on capacity like for other work. So just let me know what the two of you decide you want in terms of like how much engineering time we're putting into this for 13.11. But my expectation is we come out of 13.11 and we have the code review led vision of what we want to go do and how we want to do that. And we can, to Pedro's point above, we can involve CI, but we need to probably, and we can figure out how to do this too. We need to make sure that like we set that expectation much more clearly that like,
yeah,
this is our boat, and you're welcome to come along and do some things, but like you can't go drive the boat right now.
I think we can make that clearer. I want to make sure, I think it's important to acknowledge that for us to take ownership of this, we have to show movement. And that's what we're showing in investigating in 13.11. Because if we call for ownership and then we don't move anything, it just seems like we're blocking them. So I do agree with everything. Let's show ownership of the code review. And there's a lot of spots that they don't have visibility that will affect this work. So we are the better ones, the ones better equipped to drive the overall effort. But yes, we'll make that clear. We have a bridge with them. We don't have a meeting specifically, but we'll make sure that they understand that part. And I think they're okay as long as we have movement. If we call for ownership and then we stop in our tracks, then they might start having some resentment. Does that make sense? We'll make sure.
Yeah, I think we just need to set
expectations.
I mean, we should all be very clear that we could come out of 13.11 and still decide we don't want to do this.
Right.
And I think like that needs to be made clear to them, that if we come out and decide we don't want to do this, like that doesn't mean we want you to do it either. We sort of like, this is a bigger fish than we like anyone needs to take on right now. So I think that expectation should be clear as well.
Okay.
Good point. Gotta go.
Else?
Thank you all.
Cool. I think we're done.
Thanks everyone. I'll upload it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.